Welcome to the verse-by-verse study of the book of Revelation. Last week in chapter 16, we examined the dramatic end of this tribulation period, and with it, the end of sin, and a reshaping of earth itself, getting it ready for Christ's triumphant return. So far between chapters 6 and 16, we've been given this vivid, detailed picture of the future tribulation that's going to happen. Now in these next two chapters, 17 and 18, Christ will pause and remind us of the why of this period. Why are we going to have a tribulation period? And the answer to that is man's sin. Man, like a rebellious teenager, shakes his fist at God and rejects his wise, loving counsel, choosing instead to make bad decisions that lead to harming himself and others. Sin is so seductive. The more we sin, the easier it becomes, and the more our conscience becomes desensitized to the sin. So we know that a small lie can become a habit of lying. A small flirt can grow into a pattern of unfaithfulness. A small theft can lead to a life of dishonesty. When you and I shut out the voice of God, right and wrong loses its meaning. The answer is always, when we ask the question, what is right? Well, it depends. Can I get away with it? Does it feel good? Will it benefit me? Will it make me look good? You know, as we sin, our heart becomes harder, unresponsive, and eventually it leads to an actual hostility towards God. Let's take a look at the definition of sin itself. The word sin means missing the mark or missing the path. We choose a path that leads to harm rather than that path that God designed for us that leads to his blessings and peace and joy and purpose. So, why do we sin? What lures us? What compels us to trade something that is so pure and true in value for the lies of this world? Sin is always rooted in pride. When we're prideful, our thoughts, our sentences, our attitude begin with this word, always, I. Our view of ourself, our self-worth, is distorted because it's so dependent on other people's praise and our perceived status. We're always comparing. We value ourselves and others as either we're losing or we're winning. Life becomes this sad competition, full of anxiety and insecurity and shallow, broken relationships. A prideful attitude robs us of joy, true peace, and the security that God loves us and he's there for us. There are over 150 verses in Scripture warning us about the dangers of pride that always lead us to sin. Chapter 17 will use two different interchangeable metaphors to symbolize this attitude and action of man's sin. It'll use the city of Babylon, which it'll also call a harlot. The ancient city of Babylon was founded in disobedience to God and in man's pride. It dates all the way back to the great-grandson of Noah, King Nimrod. Here in Genesis it tells us, they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower, the Tower of Babel, that reaches to the heavens. Why? So that we may make a name for ourselves. In the last days, this city of Babylon will serve as the physical headquarters of Satan's Antichrist. It is also used to represent man's spiritual condition, that of being unfaithful and hostile to God. As we shall see in verse 1, sinful man is also symbolized as a harlot, or this great prostitute. Let's look at verse 1. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls from chapter 16 came and said to me, come, I will show you, John, the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by the many waters. The city of Babylon was indeed located between the two great rivers of the Middle East, the Tigris and the Euphrates, within that fertile crescent. And pridefully they boasted it was the most beautiful city in the world, with its hanging gardens and its many pagan temples. Now the angel continues in verse 2. With her, meaning man's sin and his unfaithfulness, the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Unfortunately, throughout history, many of our world leaders have been seduced and blinded by this satanic pride. They have chased after both personal praise and power with a prideful motivation to do what? To make a name for themselves. Now again, as we see in the next 3 verses, John will be looking back of what preceded the tribulation period, getting again into the why. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. There I saw a woman, this is the great prostitute of verse 1, who represents man's rebellion, man's sin, sitting on a scarlet beast. She's being supported by Satan's Antichrist, that was covered with blasphemous names against God and had 7 heads and 10 horns, just like was described in both Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, verse 4. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold and precious stones and pearls. She held a cup in her hand, filled with what? Filled with the abominable things, and the filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abomination of the earth. So here she's called Babylon, that city, that ancient city that began right after the flood. And these 10 horns and these crowns represent the Antichrist and those 10 nation confederation with its roots originally in the Roman Empire that will follow the Antichrist against Christ. Again, man's sin and his rebellion is symbolized by this unfaithful harlot. Also notice that man's cup of sin is full, implying that judgment is near. This harlot is sitting on the beast. Man mistakenly thinks that he's in control of sin. He pridefully thinks that by rejecting God, he has freedom. This is one of Satan's most effective lies. Sin is not freedom, but slavery. As we shall see in verse 16, the beast will turn on the woman with devastating consequences. Now next, John sees a vision that shocks him. Let's take a look, starting in verse 6. I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people, the blood of those who bore testimony, witness to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly astonished, shocked. Then the angel said to me, "Why are you astonished? I'll explain to you the mystery of the woman and of the beast she rides, which has 7 heads." Man's sin begins with a rejection of God, pushing God away. But over time, there becomes this increasing hostility towards God and his followers and his word. And we're seeing that played out today. Sinful man throughout history has increasingly attempted to silence God and God's messengers, his followers. Now in verse 8, let's take a look at what happens with this beast. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life, those that have chosen to reject God, from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast. Why? Because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. We know from Revelation chapter 11 that this Antichrist came from the abyss. And also we'll see when we get to chapter 20, both the Antichrist and Satan will finally be locked up, be, quote, destroyed, put away back into the abyss. This phrase, once was and now is not, is used several times to describe the Antichrist, both in Daniel and Revelation. We're told this because the Antichrist had this fatal wound that he boasted about and amazed sinful man. Satan wanted to deceive the world to believe that this Antichrist was all-powerful and had the power to come back from the dead, just like Christ himself. Satan consistently tries to attempt to counterfeit Christ. We were warned about Satan's attempt to confuse us and to counterfeit Christ in 2 Thessalonians. Let's take a look at that. This man, the Antichrist, will come to do the work of Satan with counterfeit power and signs and miracles. So this angel now warns us in the next verse that we need to be discerning. This calls for a mind with wisdom from the Spirit of God. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. So now we're also told this woman is not only supported by the Antichrist, the beast, she is also supported by these, quote, 7 hills. A first century audience would likely immediately associate this term, this familiar term, 7 hills, with powerful pagan city of Rome. The next verse will further describe these hills as 7 kings and kingdoms. The number 7 is a number for completeness, implying that this is a representation of sinful man's attitude and actions, which are rooted back in the Western culture of these prideful Caesars, who consistently declared themselves as gods, pridefully, to be gods to be worshipped. Let's take a look at verse 10. They, these hills, are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain only for a little while. The beast, who once was, and now is not, is the 8th king in this line of kings, 7 kings. He belongs to the 7. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. He's going back into the abyss. The 10 horns you saw are also 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour, a short time span, will receive authority as kings along with the beast. There has been much debate and speculation over these 3 passages in terms of who specifically are these kings and their kingdoms. But frankly, there's not clarity nor consensus beyond the fact it's connected to those Caesars of Rome, which is also clear that this Antichrist belongs to the 7, meaning, as we shall see, he will be this charismatic leader of this Western tradition and follow in the line of these prideful leaders. He will mislead the world and satanically sell himself as this invincible great man of Western wisdom and the only solution to world peace. He'll attempt to counterfeit himself as the Prince of Peace. Even Israel will follow him in the beginning until he demands personal worship and sets up his image in the temple itself. This reference to the 1 hour likely implies that those kings, those 10 kings that follow him, those leaders, will only be kings for a short reign because he's going to take authority, and then God's going to number his days to 3.5 years. Let's take a look at verses 13 and 14 to give us a little bit more clarity. They, these kings, have one purpose and will give their power and authority to whom? To the beast, to the Antichrist. What will they do? They will follow him and they will wage war against the Lamb, against Christ. But the Lamb will triumph over them because he is the Lord of lords and the King of kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Again, what the verse is telling us, that in those last days, many of the world's leaders, prideful world leaders, they're invested in this Western culture of me, will follow the Antichrist. And they will choose to war against the Lamb, choose to war against Christ and his followers in that battle of Armageddon, which we shall see. Recall from Daniel chapter 2, these final leaders, they were represented by those 10 toes in Daniel's vision of this statue, that statue that recorded all the progressive kingdoms, beginning with Babylon, that persecuted God and his followers. right on through the Roman Empire. These final kings will support the Antichrist, as they say, in that final battle against Christ. Daniel saw the outcome. And how did he describe the outcome? As this huge rock representing Christ that toppled this statue of rebellious man. That verse in Daniel 2 read, "It struck the statue on his feet of iron and clay. They were crushed to pieces, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. The stone that struck the statue became a great mountain," meaning Christ's new millennial kingdom, "and filled the entire earth." In the next verse 15, the angel will help us define one of the symbols they're using, this symbol of water. "Then the angel said to me, 'The water you saw where the prostitute sits was people, multitudes, nations, and languages.'" The angel is reminding us, telling us that man's sinful pride is a global issue. It's not specific to one country or one language. It infects multitudes of nations and people. Now, starting in verse 16, the angel will tell us about these last days, that God, for a brief period of time, 3.5 years, will release his restraint of Satan. And Satan and his Antichrist will stop pretending and show their true colors to the world. The beast and the 10 horns, those 10 kings you saw, will hate the prostitute, meaning sinful man. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled. What is happening here is that I believe that the church has already been raptured before the tribulation period. So God has only sinful man remaining on earth, and he's trying to get their attention and making a clear distinction between Satan and God during this tribulation period, so that sinful man will have a clear choice to understand good and evil, and many will choose Christ. The chapter ends with verse 18. "The woman you saw is the great city," meaning Babylon, "that rules over the kings of the earth." So the angel is confirming that that woman we saw in verse 1 is both physical and symbolic, prideful Babylon. That concludes chapter 17, but we're not finished examining this place called Babylon. Next week we'll get more details of her fall, which ushers in the return of Christ. Until then, may God bless you. Bless you and your family with both grace and peace. Aloha.